with the Wilds of Eldraine set coming out very soon. There's lots of cards that are going to be added to Standard, but the question is, will they change Standard very much, considering we already have 8 sets out that aren't going to be, rotating this year like normal. So we're going to have a look at some of the cards in the new set and see what I think will make a difference in Standard. Cards that are going to be really powerful, that are going to change existing decks or new decks that are going to come out of this set. So let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. We're just going to jump straight into the Wilds of Eldraine cards. We're going to look at all the cards from the set. Well, we're not going to go through all of them. We're going to go through the ones that I've picked out that I think are going to make a difference in Standard, and then talk about those really quickly. So don't forget to like the video if you find it helpful and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future videos. Right, let's get on with it. So first of all, we're going to start with going by color and in alphabetical order. So there's no it's not like a power order. It's not like top 10. We're just going to go through as quickly as possible. And I'm sure there are going to be lots of cards from Eldraine that I don't cover that are going to have an effect as well, because it's really hard to judge these things accurately. When Fable of the Mirror Breaker came out and when Shieldred came out, most people didn't think they were going to make a big difference. So we'll see. The first white card I'm going to pick out is Eerie Interference over here. It's a 3-mana instant. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to you and creatures you control this turn by creatures. So kind of a fog effect. You don't take any damage. You can still take it from non-combat, spells, play with fire, things like that. But if you get attacked by your opponents, like big creatures, an aggro deck, say it's a white deck because red decks use a lot of spells, sorcery, instant damage as well. If you're just against a white deck and they've got loads of soldiers, loads of humans out, they're attacking you with all that, and you need to delay just a little bit longer to get to the board wipe, to get enough mana to cast your Sunfall, Eerie Interference is going to prevent all damage done to you by those things, so you basically get an extra turn. So it's a kind of an interesting thing to get. I also quite like it in the Arcane Bombardment deck that I use at the moment, because if we can prevent all damage that happens and potentially do that every turn, then creature decks are completely locked out and they can't do anything at all against us, which is pretty cool. The next card that I think is pretty interesting here is Moonshaker Cavalry. Now, it's an 8-mana white spell. It needs 3 white, so it's kind of leans towards being mono white. A 6/6 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control gain flying and get +X/+X till end of turn, where X is a number of creatures you control. It kind of makes me think of Nissa with her -7 ability that gives everything +X/+X and trample, where X is a number of forests you control. So this might work really well in a kind of token deck when you get lots of tokens out, and then you get Moonshaker Cavalry out. The cavalry itself won't attack, it doesn't have haste, but it will give all your creatures a good boost and be able to do a lot of damage to the opponent, because flying could well get over their heads. And it's good to remember that you don't need to have lots of creatures for this to work. If all you have are 4 1/1s, by the time you cast this, they will all get +4/+4. So there'll be 4 5/5s with flying, so that's 20 damage. So you don't even need to have lots of things. They don't need to have high power and toughness to start with. You don't need to have like 10 creatures. Even 4 creatures is going to make a huge difference if you get a Moonshaker Cavalry out. But because it costs 8, I don't know if it'll see much play. It's kind of interesting. We'll see. It's only when it enters the battlefield as well, so you only get that one turn where you get the boost. So we'll see if it makes a difference. Kind of expensive, but interesting. And then we have the Regal Bunnycorn, a really kind of interesting card. So it's 2 mana. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of non-land permanents you control. So at the very least, you get it out by itself. It's a 1/1 for 2, which is not great. But if you get a creature out before that, or if you have something that creates, blood tokens, treasure tokens, any other non-land permanent, Power Stone tokens, then the Regal Bunnycorn is going to get stronger and stronger. If you have a deck with lots of little creatures in it, then it's going to be really, really strong. Now, it doesn't have trample, doesn't have flying, so it's easily blocked by 1/1s. So I don't know if it'll see much play, but it's an interesting one that you might want to try out in, different token builds. And also with the auras, the rolls that we're getting in Eldraine, if you can give this a monster roll, it gets +1/+1 and trample, and it'll also get an extra +1/+1 from the fact there's another non-land permanent that you control. So if you get lots of rolls out, it's going to make this very big and give it a monster roll, and it gets trample as well. So that could see some could see some play. We'll see about that. The next one I want to look at is Stroke of Midnight. It's a 3-mana instant. Destroy target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 1/1 white human creature token. Now, I imagine in almost all cases, the 1/1 is going to make very little difference. But destroying any non-land permanent for 3 mana at instant speed is a pretty good thing to add. So again, like with my Arcane Bombardment deck, which is just like the one I tend to have the most fun playing these days, apart from the mono red aggro, being able to destroy any non-land permanent every turn with an Arcane Bombardment deck, that's going to be lots of fun. But even if it's not in that kind of deck, still 3 mana destroy anything is really good. It could be creatures, could be a Shieldred, could be a Portal to Phyrexia, could be anything, and giving them a 1/1 is not going to really make any difference to you. So really, really powerful card there. And then you've got 3 Blind Mice. It's a 3-mana enchantment, a saga, where you make a 1/1 mouse creature token. On chapters 2 and 3, you get to copy a token that you control, and on turn 4, creatures get +1/+1 and gain vigilance till end of turn. That's kind of like Wedding Announcement, because you can make 3 1/1s and then you can boost them, although the boost only happens on that 4th chapter, on that last turn. So obviously, in that way, it's not as good as a Wedding Announcement. But here's the interesting thing. You make a 1/1 mouse creature token to start with. Chapter 2 and 3, you don't just make another 1/1 mouse. You create a token that's a copy of a target token you control. So you could have a token of anything, and you create a copy of that. So depending on what other tokens you might have out, it might be a roll from Eldraine, or it might be a token of any creature, or you could even use it to ramp. You could make copies of treasure tokens or something like that. So that's really interesting. Obviously, the 1/1 boost at the end doesn't make a difference if you're going to be copying like treasure tokens, but it's a much more versatile card because we can do lots of different things with it, and it works really well if you have a variety of different tokens that you might want to copy. Again, might not see much play because in a deck that has multiple creatures, lots of 1/1s coming out, you probably just want a Wedding Announcement, but this could do some different things that Wedding Announcement can't do. Then at 5 mana, we've got Virtue of Loyalty. Now, Virtue is a cycle of cards in Eldraine. There's one for each color, and they all do interesting things. This one can cast as an instant for 2 mana to start with to create a 2/2 white knight with vigilance, which isn't anything too exciting. But for 5 mana, it's an enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and you untap those creatures. So effectively vigilance. So it's a bit like Invasion of Gobekhan, where you add a +1 counter on everything that attacked that turn, but they don't have to attack. You don't have to flip a battle to get this going. So you just basically put +1/+1 counters on each creature every turn, and if you do attack with them, you get to untap them. Or if they have some other ability where you tap them for mana or tap them for anything at all, they untap again. So yeah, really interesting enchantment. It's going to boost lots of creatures really high, and it's going to make it pretty difficult to keep up if they're all getting +1 counters each turn. And if you have something like the Ozolith or the Kami that adds extra counters on things, then it's not going to be 1/+1 counter each turn. It's going to be 2 or 3 or maybe more. So really, really strong enchantment. I really like that one. And just next door to the Virtue of Loyalty, we have the Werefox Bodyguard. It's a 3-mana, basically Brutal Cathar. Pretty much. It's flash. It's a 2/2. When it enters, you exile up to one other target non-fox creature until the bodyguard leaves the battlefield. And you can sacrifice it to gain 2 life. So you can use this to exile an opponent's creature like you would with a Brutal Cathar. But being flash is kind of interesting as well. You might get your opponents attacking. You might then flash out the bodyguard, exile one of your creatures, and then you could sacrifice it at instant speed as well, and the creature comes back. Like if you have a prototype creature, it comes back as the bigger version. Or you could do this before a board wipe. If the opponent is going to Sunfall, you can then put out Bodyguard, protect your biggest thing. Bodyguard gets killed by the Sunfall, or exiled by the Sunfall, and then your creature comes back, everything else is dead, and you've got one thing left on the battlefield. So definitely more cases where it could be used, as opposed to Brutal Cathar. Flash is really useful as well. So that's one I'm going to have fun trying out in different situations. Moving on to the blue cards, the first one that I thought was really interesting was Asinine Antics. which is kind of fairies causing mischief here. If you cast it, you can cast it as though it had flash if you pay 2 more to cast it. So it's a sorcery for 4 mana, or it's an instant for 6 mana. And for each creature your opponents control, you create a cursed roll token attached to that creature. So they all basically become 1/1s. So it's not a board wipe, but it kind of works a bit like a board wipe. No matter what your opponents have, they all turn into 1/1s as long as those roll tokens stay there. So it's a great way to neutralize your opponent's, Atalis, Atraxas, Shieldreds, all those big horrible things. Even like a Tyrannax Rex, because it doesn't target, so you don't have to pay ward costs. So basically you just turn everything into a 1/1, which is pretty good. It also doesn't affect your creatures, because it's only for each creature your opponents control, so it's kind of a one-sided board wipe for blue at 4 mana, which is really interesting. Next in blue we have Sleep Cursed Fairy. It's a 1 mana 3/3, but the reason why it's so powerful, and also by the way flying and ward too, it's so powerful because when it enters the battlefield it's tapped and it has 3 stun counters on it, which means it takes 3 more turns for it to untap and be able to be used. So it does take a bit to get it going, but you can also pay 2 mana to try to untap it, which will remove a stun counter rather than untapping it if it still has stun counters on it. So basically, pay a few mana and you start to get a very powerful, for the early game, 3/3 flying ward 2 creature. And considering that fairies are a very, very strongly supported creature type in the Eldraine set, we might be seeing a blue or blue-black fairy decks, fairy control decks coming out, or tempo decks. So this might be a really important one in those kind of decks. And speaking of fairy decks, we also have a 2 mana counterspell, Spell Stutter. You counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, which is a bit like Make Disappear, plus an additional 1 for each fairy you control. So the difference is with Make Disappear, you can make them pay 2, or you can sacrifice a creature and make them pay 4, or with Spell Stutter, you can make them pay 2 plus 1 for each fairy you control. So if you control at least 1 fairy, then they have to pay 3, and you don't even have to sacrifice the fairy if you have 2 or 3 or 4 fairies. Then Spell Stutter becomes pretty much counter anything, because the opponent isn't going to have like 6 mana to pay every time they cast a spell. So Spell Stutter is going to be a really powerful counter spell in a fairy tribal control deck. So really interesting counter spell to add there, but only really does anything extra for fairy decks. The next blue card I'm going to look at is the blue Virtue card, Virtue of Knowledge. It's, first of all, it's a 2 mana instant where you copy target activated or triggered ability you control, which can be used for a variety of different things. So it's really interesting that you can basically just do that for 2 mana. And then you have 5 mana enchantment. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it does an additional time. So a bit like Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines, causing ETB triggers to basically happen twice. We now have that in blue as well. So depending on what ETB triggers you want to copy, this could be a very, very powerful card, because Elesh Norn has the downside of being a creature that in theory you can just remove pretty easily with Go for the Throat. Virtue of Knowledge being an enchantment is a little bit harder to remove, although there are quite a few ways to remove enchantments in the Eldraine set, probably because of the heavy focus on enchantments and rolls and things like that, but it's going to be slightly harder to remove. So even if you get this out, Virtue of Knowledge out, you get out a Portal to Phyrexia, the opponent then has to sacrifice 6 creatures instead of 3. So it's going to do quite a lot when you have any big ETB triggers. Moving on to black, we have a few different things in black that are really interesting, even at the common and uncommon level. First of all, we have Back for Seconds. It's a 3 mana sorcery where you can return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, which isn't anything amazing by itself, but if you bargain this, which is sacrificing an artifact, enchantment, or token when you cast it, you can put one of those cards with mana value 4 or less onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your hand. So you're basically just reanimating something where you're only really spending 3 mana. And we know there's loads of things in black that are really, really good at 3 and 4 mana, from Graveyard Trespasser, the Shieldred, Obliterator, all kinds of things. I don't know, Archfiend of the Dross, and we can bring them back for seconds. So that's a really interesting reanimation spell for relatively smaller creatures that may see some play. Seems kind of nice. And I shouldn't skip over Ashiok here, because Ashiok is probably going to be one that people really want to try out first of all, because we've got a 5 mana Planeswalker, which can basically, instead of paying life just exile cards from the top of your library instead, and you can do some interesting things with those exiled cards. You can do +1 to look at the top 2 cards of your library and exile one of them, put the other into your hand, so you're drawing a card and exiling one at the same time. You can do -2 to create 2 1/1 black nightmare creature tokens, where at the beginning of combat, if a card's put into exile, you put a +1/+1 counter on them, which is okay. There's 2 of them, which is kind of nice, but it only happens once per turn, which isn't as good as it could be. But then we have the -7. Target player exiles the top X cards of their library, where X is the total mana value of cards you own in exile. So it's not the number of cards you own in exile, it's the total mana value of those cards. So if you have a few big cards in exile, then you might be able to make the opponent exile the top 10 or 20 cards of their library. So it's basically a mill strategy, but it's an exile from their library strategy. So it's a very interesting win con there to basically empty their library in a way that's kind of like milling. And I'm sure lots of people will try that out. So Ashiok is going to be really interesting as well. Then we have Beseech the Mirror, which is a 4-mana sorcery, heavy on the black requirement though. So you can't really play this quite so easily in multicolored decks. But you can search your library for a card, exile it face down, and shuffle. If you bargain, sacrifice artifact, enchantment, or token, you can cast the exiled cards without paying its mana cost if it's mana value 4 or less, or put the exiled card into your hand if you don't do that. So it's a tutor for anything that is, anything up to 4 mana, but probably won't use it for anything less than 3, I guess. But you could you could be looking at just finding a removal spell. If you absolutely don't have one and you absolutely need it, then casting a 4-mana sorcery to get any removal spell in your deck is not too bad. Being able to cast it immediately as well is great. But obviously you can also tutor for a Liliana, Graveyard Trespasser, Shieldred, Obliterator, all those really powerful things. We know obviously it just basically means you can get your Shieldred out earlier. If you haven't drawn it, you can find it with Beseech the Mirror. But there is the slight downside or added requirement of having to bargain something. So you need to have an artifact, enchantment, or token to bargain in order to get the most value out of this. So as long as there are ways of making those artifacts, it might be as simple as having a Blood Tithe Harvester that makes a blood token, then this becomes a very, very powerful tutor spell. And along the same lines of reanimating or cheating things out, we have Lich Knight's Conquest, a 5-mana sorcery. Sacrifice any number of artifacts, enchantments, and/or tokens. Return that many creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So it's a mass reanimation spell. And it could even be that you just sacrifice one artifact, enchantment, or token, which is basically bargain, and return any one creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. But being able to do this for 2 or 3 or 4 creatures, or as many creatures as you want, as number of, matching the number of artifacts, enchantments, and tokens you have, you can get loads of really powerful creatures from the battlefield, from the graveyard back to the battlefield. So that's a really, really interesting reanimation spell, as long as you have lots of things that you can sacrifice. So as long as we, get ways to sacrifice things, this is going to be really, really powerful. And in black, in Eldraine, we also have some interesting rat synergies, as well as the fairy synergies we have mostly in blue. We have rats, led by Lord Skitter, Sewer King. So it's a 3-mana, 3/3. Whenever another rat enters the battlefield under your control, exile up to 1 target card from an opponent's graveyard, which is nice. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 rat that cannot block. So really good for graveyard control for the opponent, but also just a way of creating creatures every single turn. And there's lots of other cards that work with rats and Lord Skitter, like Lord Skitter's Blessing, a 2-mana enchantment. When it enters, create a Wicked Roll token. That's a +1/+1. And when it dies, opponent loses 1 life. And at the beginning of your draw step, if you control an enchanted creature, you lose 1 life and you draw an additional card. It's a bit like Phyrexian Arena, but you need to have an enchanted creature for it to actually work, but basically a slightly cheaper Phyrexian Arena. So there's lots you can do with black and with red as a kind of rat aggro kind of deck. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that works out, if that just works in limited or if it works really well in constructed. But yeah, there's lots of rat focused cards that work really well together. Led by Lord Skitter. Then we have Spiteful Hexmage, a 1-mana, 3/2 human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, create a Cursed Roll token. That's a 1/1 creature, but turns a creature into a 1/1 creature. attached to a creature you control. So it looks really good, 1 mana, 3/2, but if you get it out on turn 1 by itself, it becomes a 1/1 because it then is cursed. Of course, you can do anything to create a new role token, and that will get rid of the curse, and basically it will just get the +1/+1 and whatever else you give it with the other role. But if this isn't the first thing you get out and you get to put the cursed token onto something else, then this is a 3/2 that comes out really early on. So it's an interesting black card to have, black creature to have. Then we have The End, a 4 mana instant, which costs 2 less if your life total is 5 or less. So if you're very near dead, this is only a 2 mana instant, but otherwise 4 mana instant. Exile target creature or planeswalker, search its controller's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the same name, and then you exile them. And they get to draw a card for each card exiled from the hand this way. So one way to remove your opponent's win con, if they're a mill deck and they're hitting you with Teresian Mindbreakers or Jace, maybe you could use the End to get rid of Jace and also get rid of every other version they have in their graveyard or in their library. So it kind of removes their win con. If you're against a domain control deck, you can remove their Atalis and Atraxas, and that takes a lot of the steam out of them because everything else is pretty much building up to that. The only downside of this is that there has to be one on the battlefield for you to exile, because you can't just search for any card without having done that. So you have to exile a creature that's out or a planeswalker that's out already, and then you get rid of the other ones. So possibly a really interesting removal spell to take away the win con, or the biggest thing your opponent is going to have. It's really important for cards like this to know what your opponent is likely to have, or what their win con is, because if you're not sure what they're doing and then they hit you with a Jace, then it's going to be too late to know what's happening. This card is one reason why it's really important to know what kind of cards your opponent's going to have and what their win condition might be, because once they play a creature or planeswalker that will be key to them trying to win, you can remove that, remove the other copies, and there's a good chance they might quit at that point. And then we're going to look at the Virtue card in black, which is Virtue of Persistence. It's a 2 mana sorcery. Target creature gets -3/-3 till the end of turn. You gain 2 life, which isn't anything amazing in itself. We already have Drown in Ichor, which is a -4/-4 for 2 mana sorcery speed. So that's not amazing. But then we have a 7 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature cards from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So very much like a Portal to Phyrexia, apart from it costs 2 mana less, and it doesn't make your opponent sacrifice 3 creatures when you put it out. So it's really nice that it's only 7 mana. It's much easier to get out than a Portal to Phyrexia if you're not relying on the opponent sacrificing their creatures. In red, we've got, first of all, Charming Scoundrel. It's a 2 mana 1/1 with haste, which doesn't sound that impressive, but when it enters the battlefield, you can choose to discard a card and draw one. You can create a treasure token, or you can create a Wicked Roll token attached to a target creature. If you attach the Wicked Roll to Charming Scoundrel, then it becomes a 2/2, and when it dies, the opponent loses 1 life as well. So a 2 mana 2/2 with haste that does extra damage when it dies is not too bad in some kind of mono red aggro deck. Also has the ability to discard and draw if you're flooding out, or create treasure tokens if you need to ramp up to a bigger thing like a Thundering Raiju or a Sheeran Devastator. So that works pretty well in aggro decks, and it might find another place in other decks as well, but it's definitely one that I would like to try out. And then we have Frantic Firebolt, a 3 mana instant, X damage to target creature, where X is 2 plus the number of cards in your graveyard that are instants or sorceries or have an adventure. So there's quite a few different things you could have that are putting instants and sorceries into the graveyard, and then Frantic Firebolt can do lots and lots of damage to an opponent's creature. If you only have 1 instant or sorcery or card with adventure in the graveyard, this is doing 3 damage for 3 mana. If you have 2 of them in the graveyard, it's doing 4 damage for 3 mana. It starts to scale up pretty quickly, so it's a very good card to have in a deck that's very heavy on instants and sorceries if you're using that kind of spells deck. And then back to hasty creatures, we have Godric Cloaked Leveler, a 3 mana 3/3 with haste, and it has celebration, so as long as 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control. It also is a dragon with base power and toughness 4/4, has flying, and pay red for all dragons you control to get +1/+0 till end of turn. So this won't come out as a dragon on turn 3 when you're paying 3 mana for it, because you need to have at least one other non-land permanent enter the battlefield under your control that turn, but it could be a 1-mana creature, and then you play Godric, and suddenly you have a 4/4 flying haste dragon for 3 mana alongside whatever else you played. So it can be really powerful, and the mono red aggro deck that I use at the moment has some good dragon synergy, so I might be trying this one out in the deck, possibly. Because you could even use something like Invasion of Tarkir is another non-land permanent, although it also works as a burn spell, so you could take out something of the opponent's, then put Godric out and become a 4/4 dragon, and you get lots of interesting dragon synergies. We've got a really good 1-mana instant combat trick in Monstrous Rage. Target creature gets +2/+0, and you create a monster roll token attached to it. So the monster roll token gives it +1/+1 and trample anyway. So you're basically, for 1 mana, giving something +3/+1 and trample. And some of the +1/+1 stays, and the trample stays ongoing as well. In a previous mono red aggro deck that I played that used a lot of combat tricks, I used to use Stolen Vitality, which was a 2-mana instant. Give your creature +3/+1 and trample till end of turn. This is strictly a much better version of that. It's only 1 mana, and one of the +1/+1, some of the boost stays and the trample stays, and it's also another non-land permanent entering, so it will trigger things like Celebration, especially with Godric that we had just now. And while we're thinking about red dragons, we also have Realm Scorcher Hellkite, a 6-mana dragon, which is a 4/6 with flying and haste. And when it enters the battlefield, if you bargained it, you add 4 mana in any combination of colors. So it's a big, dangerous thing that your opponent has to get rid of before you start doing too much damage with it. And also, you get to pay 2 mana to do 1 damage to any target, so you can start picking things off. So that might also work well in some kind of dragon deck. Next to the Realm Scorcher, we also have Redcap Gutter Dweller, a 4-mana 3/3 goblin with menace. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 rat tokens, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you can sacrifice another creature, so probably one of those rats. If you do, you put a +1/+1 counter on Redcap Gutter Dweller and exile the top card of your library that you can play this turn. So it basically grows by itself every turn. If you have some other way of making rat creatures that it can feast on, then it's going to keep getting bigger, and the extra card advantage of cards you can play this turn might make a big difference as well. So we've got lots of goblins and rats going on in this set. It's going to be interesting to see how they work out. And speaking of rats, we also have an interesting sorcery here, Song of Totenance, which I might be pronouncing wrong, which is X and red sorcery to create X 1/1 rat creature tokens. So if you want to make lots of food for the Gutter Dweller, or you just want to attack with lots of 1/1 rat creatures, this is one way of getting lots and lots of creatures out pretty easily. It also works really well with all kinds of fun decks like Devilish Valet, because you can make as many creature tokens as you want, depending on how much mana you have, which can make things like Devilish Valet get incredibly strong very, very quickly. Onto the red Virtue, we have Virtue of Courage. It starts as a 2-mana instant to do 2 damage to any target, which is okay. And then it's a 5-mana enchantment. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, you can exile that many cards from the top of your library and play those cards this turn. So it's only non-combat damage, and you have to play them this turn, not next turn. So it works pretty well on maybe like an Urabrask deck. Wherever you play anything, it does non-combat damage to your opponent, and getting an extra card that you could play this turn could make a big difference to that. But yeah, so some kind of storm deck that's going to get lots of little spells off one after the other. It's going to be an interesting way to use Virtue of Courage. And then we have one other removal spell that I think is really fun, which is Witch Stalker Frenzy. It's normally a 4-mana instant that does 5 damage to a creature, which is not a very, very good rate, but it also costs 1 less for each creature that attacked this turn. So if you're playing a deck where you have at least 3 creatures and you attack with them, you can cast this instant, which is a 1-mana Shield Red removal, but 5 damage to any target at such a low cost. Could even be a Tolarian Terror or Haughty Djinn, or it could be an Adeline or any creature that's going to cause a bit of trouble for you. Doing 5 damage to any target is pretty good. Also, it could deal with like Atalis and Atraxas, because all they have to do is block a creature that does 2 damage for the 5 extra damage to be enough to kill them. So possibly a really cheap, fun, useful removal spell there. Moving on to green, we have, first of all, Blossoming Tortoise. It's a 4-mana, 3/3 turtle. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you mill 3 cards and then return a land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, which is a really nice way to wrap up. And activated abilities of lands you control cost 1 less to activate. So that could be, Mirrex or any other utility lands, Field of Ruin, things like that. But also the land creatures that we're going to come to later on in this video. But also land creatures you control get +1/+1, so they help each other out as well. This will work in some ways with Wrenn and Realmbreaker, which can turn lands into creatures. So instead of being a 3/3, they're now a 4/4 until the end of next turn. So it's one way of making those even more useful. And milling that many things when it enters the battlefield and when it attacks might even work really well with Wrenn and Realmbreaker's final ability, ultimate ability of being able to cast anything from your graveyard. You're going to have a lot of things effectively in your hand if you have a quite full graveyard and you're able to cast things from it. Then we have Elvish Archivist here, a 2-mana 0/1 elf creature. Whenever one or more artifacts enters the battlefield under your control, put 2 +1/+1 counters on the Archivist. It only triggers once each turn, and whenever one or more enchantments enter the battlefield under your control, you draw a card up to once per turn. So works well with role tokens. Artifacts could be anything, like I said, from blood tokens, treasure tokens, or any other like artifact creatures and things like that. There are some good artifact synergies in green at the moment with like Teething Wormlet and things like that. Garligritas creating treasure tokens, lots of things that can create artifacts and lots of things that can create enchantments, especially in this set. So Elvish Archivist can get itself from a 0/1 to a 2/3 very quickly. In fact, if you put it out and then have Garligritas that creates a treasure token, this becomes a 2/3 immediately for 2 mana that has all these extra abilities of drawing cards and adding more counters. So Elvish Archivist might be a really interesting card to have in some kind of green artifact synergy deck, or maybe just a green or white counter deck. The next green card I want to look at is Ferocious Werefox. Now, as a creature, it's a 4-mana 4/3 with trample, which isn't that incredible at all. It's also a common, but it gives us the ability to use Guard Change, a 2-mana instant, to create a monster role token attached to a creature we control. So it gives something +1/+1 and trample. This also works really well in enchantment synergy decks, so like the Calyx deck, where you can give something +1/+1 and trample, which also makes it an enchanted creature, which means Calyx will then be able to copy an enchantment if it does combat damage to the opponent, which it most likely will, giving it +1/+1 and trample. So there's probably other ways in the set to give role tokens at instant speed, but being in green or white especially makes this really powerful for the Calyx deck, so we'll see how much of a difference these kind of cards make to that deck. Next we have Gruff Triplets, a 6-mana 3/3 creature that has trample. So sounds really weak, but when it enters the battlefield, you create 2 tokens that are copies of it. So we're paying 6 mana to get 9/9 worth of power, so 3 3/3s for trample. And when it dies, you can put a number of +1 counters equal to its power onto each creature you control named Gruff Triplets. So not only are you getting 9 powers worth of creature out, when one of them dies, you put a number of +1 counters on to each creature you control named Gruff Triplets. So if you have 3 3/3s and one of them dies, you're then putting 3 +1 counters on the other 2. So it's going from being 3 3/3s to being 2 6/6s. And when one of those dies, when the 6/6 dies, it's going to put those counters on the last one, and it's going to become a 12/12 with trample. And that's if your opponent's removing things one at a time. So this is one really interesting card for green that might help it survive the amount of spot removal that's in standard at the moment, because when they kill these, those counters just keep going around, and there's other different things we can do with counters that are really interesting. So like Quirion Beastcaller that gets counters on it when you cast other creature spells and can move those counters when it dies. Well, if you move more counters onto Gruff Triplets, then those counters will then effectively be spread out when that creature dies. So it's going to make an interesting lot of difference having all these +1 counters, and going to make it difficult for your opponent to actually remove your creatures because they just keep consolidating their power onto each other. So I can see some mono green decks that have, Ozolith and the Kami that adds extra +1 counters, and then Beast Cooler and something like Gruff Triplets. I can see that all working together pretty well. Maybe like Defiler of Vigor as well. And you've got a great green deck that makes lots of +1 counters, makes good use of those. So it'll be interesting to see what people do with Gruff Triplets. Then we're going to jump down to the green virtue, which is Virtue of Strength. So to start with, for 1 mana at sorcery speed, we can return a creature or land from our graveyard to our hand, which is kind of nice if something's been killed early on. And then we can cast this for 7 mana as an enchantment. If you tap a basic land for mana, it produces 3 times as much of that mana instead. So really important that we use basic lands here and not other non-basic lands, but it's going to make green generate a lot of mana to cast some really big things. So Virtue of Strength could be a good, interesting one as well. Moving on to multicolored spells, which includes cards that have adventure that are off color. We then have Callous Sellsword, which doesn't seem like an amazing card to start with. It's a 2 mana 2/2 that enters with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that died under your control that turn. But you can cast the adventure Burn Together. Pay 1 red mana sorcery speed. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to any other target, which is a bit like a green card. A bite spell, and then you sacrifice that creature. So if you manage to kill the opponent's thing with one of your creatures you're sacrificing, that's 2 things that have died that turn. The Callous Sellsword enters with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that died under your control. So it's only one of those that's going to add the counter, but you've pretty much got 3 mana, remove something of the opponent's or trade it with one of your creatures, and then get out a 3/3. So that's okay as it is, but also you could have you could attack with lots of creatures. There's lots of blocks that happen. Lots of your creatures die, and then you put out a Callous Sellsword. It's going to come in as a much bigger creature as well. So there's different ways you could use that one. We have another dragon in the set. This time it's Decadent Dragon, a 4 mana 4/4 flying trample. Whenever it attacks, you create a treasure token, but it also has a 3 mana instant black adventure. Exile top 2 cards of the target opponent's library face down. You may look at them and play them for as long as they remain exiled. It doesn't say you can cast them using any lands as any mana, basically, as any color, but you do get to create treasure tokens if the creature gets out and survives and manages to attack. So you might be able to cast some very powerful things from the opponent if you ramp up to that and create treasure tokens to be able to cast things that aren't in your colors. I don't know if it necessarily goes with other dragon cards that I've seen in a dragon synergy deck, but it's one that could work pretty well, so it'd be nice to find out. Then we've got Elusive Otter. It's a 1 mana creature that has prowess. So it gets +1/+1 till end of turn for each non-creature spell you cast, and creatures with power less than the otter's power can't block it. So you can't block it with lots of little things. You need something big to block it. Otherwise, it's just going to go over their head, be very elusive. But also, you can cast the Adventure, which is an X green sorcery, where you distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So if you wanted to maybe put lots of counters on an otter, you'd need to have 2 of them, because you need to be able to cast a creature first and then cast the sorcery, the Adventure, to put lots of counters onto it. But if it's later on in the game and you have a lot of mana, you can put lots and lots of tokens on the otter, and then creatures with power less than it can't block it. So if it gets to be a 5/5 or an 8/8, it's going to be unblockable as well. So really not too bad for 1 mana if you can manage to boost it, but you don't need to necessarily put +1 counters on it because it has prowess, so you might be able to cast a few other instants that might draw extra cards and help keep it going, and Elusive Otter could get pretty strong very quickly. Next to the Otter, we've got Ariat of the Charmed Apple, which I think is, of all the pre-order bundle cards that are available, this one, which you can get with the Mastery Pass bundle, is probably my favorite of the 3. And it's a 3 mana 2/4 creature where each creature that's enchanted by an aura you control can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, so it helps to shut down the opponent's things, especially if you're putting lots of roll tokens on things, because it's an easy way to put things on the opponent's creatures. And at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is a number of auras you control. So it's not just roll tokens, it's also things like Ossification, which is decent cheap removal, is an aura because it attaches to a land. So that's one way that the opponent's going to get drained out relatively quickly. So we'll see how that works in decks from Eldraine, like draft decks, that just pretty much use the roll tokens, but it'll be even more interesting to see how that works in standard with all the different auras we have in standard at the moment. Following on to the next witch, we have Hilda of the Icy Crown, a 4-mana 3/4 human warlock that says whenever you tap an untapped creature an opponent controls, you may pay 1. When you do, you can either make a 4/4 elemental creature, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, which could be quite a few creatures in theory, or you can scry 2 and draw a card. So either of those options for 1 mana is pretty good if you manage to tap an untapped creature the opponent controls, and there are quite a few different ways in this set to be able to tap the opponent's creatures, so this is something that might happen every turn, or you might be able to basically build up lots of things pretty quickly with this. Blue and white and that kind of strategy that Hilda represents isn't the kind that I normally play, but I might give it a go and see if it's fun as well. Mosswood Dread Knight is one I can't wait to try out as well. It's a 2-mana 3/2 with Trample, but it also has the sorcery, the adventure, Dread Whispers, a 2-mana draw a card, lose 1 life, which is nothing exciting or hugely exciting by itself. But a 2-mana 3/2 with Trample, and when it dies, you may cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. And being able to cast that adventure then puts the card back into exile, which means you can cast the Mosswood Dread Knight again. So it's a pretty good recurring threat. If the opponent can't exile it, and it's going to keep coming back and bring you value over and over again. We've got more fairy synergy from Obira, is that how you say it? Dreaming Duelist, a 2-mana 2/2 flash flying fairy. Whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. So you could have lots of fairies coming out, draining the opponent over and over again. So that's just another piece in a blue and black fairy tribal deck, fairy control deck. So we'll see how that comes across when we start getting to use the cards. And then we have Questing Druid, a 2-mana 1/1 creature, which says whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, you put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. So it might be a 1/1 to start with, but once you cast other things, it's going to get bigger pretty quickly, as long as you're casting things that aren't green or aren't just green. And it also has the adventure Seek the Beast, a 2-mana instant that's red. Exile top 2 of your library until the end of your next end step. You may cast those cards, so just like Reckless Impulse, you can basically get 2 cards that you could possibly play. So being able to get Questing Druid out and growing it really quickly by casting lots of other spells that are more than just green is going to be an interesting use of that card. And next to the Questing Druid, we have Rowan, Scion of War, which I think people haven't been that excited by, but I kind of feel like there's going to be some interesting ways of using this card. So it's a 3-mana 4/2 with Menace creature, and you can tap it to say spells that you cast this turn that are black and or red cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you lost this turn, activate only as a sorcery. So we need to use this on our turn, which means we need to lose life on our turn to be able to cast big things for cheaper. So the extreme example of this would be if you have Sulphurous Springs, which is the red and black pain land. You could, in theory, tap all of those pain lands to take the damage, which means you're going to be casting instants and sorceries that are red or black for 4 mana less than normal. If you tap Rowan, which means if you get Rowan out on turn 3 and on turn 4, you have your 4th pain land, and you do all that damage to yourself, then you can cast something like a Breach to Multiverse on turn 4 without ramping up in any other way apart from taking some damage. So yeah, it's a 7-mana sorcery, you can cast that. Also, this works on casting multiple spells. So if you took 2 damage this turn and then you tap Rowan, then you can cast all of the instants and sorceries you have for 2 mana less than normal, which is going to make lots of things much cheaper. So it's a bit like Mind Splice Apparatus in that way, that it makes everything cheaper. But it does have the limitation that you have to tap Rowan, which you can only do on your turn. So you can't get to cast these things cheaply on the opponent's turn, but at least you can do lots of things with it on your turn. It's going to be really interesting to see if anyone can get Breach the Multiverse going off really, really early with this, which is probably going to end the game. You're going to get your biggest thing, which even if it's a Shieldred, is going to be a big pain for the opponent. And then you're going to get their best thing as well on turn 4. Yeah, I think this is going to maybe work out pretty well. It's definitely one I want to play around with and see what we can do. And then another addition to the fairy deck is Talion, the Kindly Lord, 4 mana, 3/4 creature with flying. When it enters the battlefield, choose a number between 1 and 10. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value or power or toughness equal to the chosen number, they lose 2 life and you draw a card. So if you pick something that's pretty likely to come up, so like, a 3 or a 4, depending on what turn you're on, and what kind of deck your opponent is playing. If you know what they're pretty much going to be casting, then you can make it so that you're basically getting extra life, or they're losing life, and you're getting extra cards every turn. So, yeah, and that stays around for as long as Talion stays around. So it's not just on the turn that it comes out, or, the next turn cycle. It's forever. That number is going to be there forever. So it might really shut your opponent's decks down. And then we have the Goose Mother. So it's green and blue. It's a 2/2 legendary Hydra bird creature that has X in its cost. It's flying, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. So if you cast this for 3 mana in total, it comes out as a 3/3, so that scales up. 4 mana becomes a 4/4, and when it enters the battlefield, you create half X food tokens rounded up, so at least 1, even if you only cast it for the 3 mana as a 3/3. And whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice a food to draw a card. So you could end up with lots of food tokens just from the Goose Mother, but you can also create food tokens elsewhere. And then whenever you're attacking with a relatively big flying creature, then you get to draw extra cards instead of gaining the life, depending on what you need most from those food tokens. So it's got some nice versatility to it. We've also got Twining Twins, or is it Twining Twins? A 4 mana 4/4 fairy, a flying vigilance ward 1, which is really powerful by itself, but it also has the 2 mana white instant adventure. Exile target non-land, non-token creature, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, beginning of the next end step, so a kind of blink effect, but also just being a 4 mana flying vigilance ward 1 4/4 creature is not too bad either. But knowing that you can use the Swift Spiral instant as protection, or as moving something of the opponents out the way so you can do some damage, it's nice to have a couple of options of what to do with that card as well, so maybe that'll see quite a bit of play in a fairy deck. We've got Will, Sign of Peace, which is the opposite side to Rowan, but it's a 3 mana 2/4 instead of a 4/2. It has Vigilance instead of Menace, and you can tap it where spells you cast this turn that are white or blue cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life you've gained this turn. I feel like it's not quite as easy to pull off as the Rowan card, because it's easy to lose life by doing damage to yourself with Painlands, or if you have something like Phyrexian Arena. But being able to gain a good amount of life at the beginning of a turn when you're white and blue, I don't see how you're going to do that too easily without having to spend some of your mana already, which makes the discount on other spells you cast maybe not as good because you've already used some of your lands, some of your mana that turn. We'll see if this gets as much play. I feel like Rowan's going to do a lot better than Will for this one. Moving into colorless cards, we have the Iron Crag, a 2 mana artifact that you can tap for colorless mana, so it gets to ramp. And whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may have it become a legendary equipment instead, called Everflame Hero's Legacy. If you do, it gains equip 3 mana, and equipped creature gets +3/+3 and loses all other abilities. So normally legendary creatures have some useful abilities to them. So you might not want to get rid of your creature's abilities, depending on what creatures you have. +3/+3 for 3 mana maybe isn't as good as it just being a 2 mana ramp artifact. But we'll see how much this card gets played anyway. And last but definitely not least, we have the 5 different creature lands. That's 2-color lands that come in tapped that can turn into a variety of creatures. We have the red and white one that becomes a 2/2 ox creature that can put +1/+1 counters on creatures you control. We've got the black and green land that becomes a 4/4 horror creature till end of turn, and when it attacks, you create a food token and exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So it does lots of different things. We've got the fortress, which is the white and black version, and can become a 1/4 white and black nightmare creature, but whenever it attacks, the opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So the 1/4, sounding not very powerful, is balanced out by that life gain and life drain. And then we have the blue and red Spire, which can become a 2/1 blue and red elemental creature and potentially have first strike, or at least has first strike on your turn, and it gets to scry when it attacks as well. And then we have the Vinestalk, the green and blue land that becomes a 5/5 plant creature with trample, and when it attacks, up to one other target creature has base power and toughness 3/3 till end of turn. So it could be one of the opponent's creatures that you want to turn its power and toughness into 3/3, which makes it easier for the trample to get through. Or maybe you're attacking with a smaller creature that you want to boost up as well. You could do that. I'm sure all of these lands are going to get to see quite a bit of play, and the particular colour pairs that they're in might become more popular in Standard as a result. We haven't had very good creature lands in Standard for the last year or so. Mishra's Foundry is good, but these work slightly differently and do things that the colour pairs seem to care about. Like scrying for blue and red looks interesting, having trample and making things bigger with green and blue is interesting too. So these might work a bit better than Mishra's Foundry, especially considering the Foundry is colourless mana only, and this is the colours, or two colours that might be very relevant, but they have the downside of coming in tapped. So we'll see how that plays out, and if coming in tapped makes them slightly more awkward to play. So we're going to wrap this video up as quickly as possible. Those are some of the cards I've picked out as ones I want to use and I think might have an effect on Standard, or at least the decks that I like to play. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I would love to know what the most anticipated card in Eldraine is for you. So what cards are you really looking forward to trying, or maybe what cards are you really not looking forward to playing against? Let me know that in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it was helpful and subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss out on any future videos. Thanks for watching this one to the end, and I will see you in the next one.